Leading a Software Engineering Team with Ryan Riley.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies building mission-critical software systems. And a quick announcement, we have our software architect forums and software leadership forums going. And those are peer advisory boards, totally free for the community. I facilitate them once a month. And basically 2 tracks. The Software Architect Forum is the more technical track for architects and lead engineers who are running their software engineering teams personally. And then the Software Leadership Forum is for the technical management chain, managers, VPs of engineering, CTOs, people who are overseeing multiple software engineering groups. And the overall goal is that our teams are delivering world-class custom software and doing an absolutely amazing job at it. And everybody is loving life. So the link for signups are in the show notes. And you can also find it at clearmeasure.com/forums. And if you're also looking for my video podcast, Programming with Palermo, just search for it in any of the podcast directories and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Ryan Riley. He is a principal software engineer at WiseRock in Houston, Texas, and he enjoys learning and collaborating on simple, creative solutions to problems and implementing those solutions with others through teamwork and training and mentoring. And he's worked as a solution architect and team lead for both local and remote teams, focusing on front-end, UX, and back-end distributed applications and APIs to delight customers across many industries. And he's been a programmer for over 20 years. The time keeps ticking. Ryan, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, Jeffrey. Thank you very much for having me today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And one thing, about our history, we kind of reconnected. You and I were both in the same major at Texas A&M University at the same time, walking the same halls.
That's right. For about 3 semesters, and then I switched to business. But then I think we actually met through the Aggie Wranglers dance lessons, because I think you're one of my teachers in that. Yep. So it's been fun reconnecting, and people asking, "How did you meet Jeffrey?" And I keep remembering that. So thank you. It's a long overdue. Thank you for teaching me how to dance.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. Texas A&M is one of the few universities that has an official university country and western performing dance team. And yeah, we also taught lessons. So that was fun. Especially in the Houston and Texas area, there's plenty of listeners that have heard you speak at, some of the conferences, and you've done quite a few things along the way. And Microsoft has recognized you as a Microsoft MVP for a number of years. But for all the listeners that aren't familiar with your work, let's do more of a deeper introduction. Give us some highlights or some high points along your career that kind of led you to the type of work you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. So I ended up graduating right as the .com bubble burst. And so I couldn't actually start in IT, or at least didn't have the guts to hold out for a job in IT. So I started off in audit and did a bunch of Microsoft Office applications for tracking and building tools for performing audits and things like internal controls, Sarbanes-Oxley, that sort of stuff. And finally got a break doing full-time professional development with Catapult Systems. And then that actually introduced me to the .NET space. I'd been doing a bunch of Python and Ruby stuff in the background. And somehow through just being a little bit more gutsy and doing presentations that were, I think, looking back, were terrible presentations. met people like yourself and Glenn Block and others who kind of me and gave me opportunities to work in I think at the time it was the WCF Web API that Glenn led,
Hmm.
and that helped kind of start the Open project, the Open Web Interface for .NET, which is I think a lot of people who've been in .NET for at least a decade probably remember that.
Owen, yeah.
Um, I called myself like an Owen instigator because I kind of got a bunch of people. This may be a little bit too generous towards myself, but it seemed like a lot of that led to what became ASP.NET Core and all the new stuff. So that's been exciting to see. I'm not claiming that that's any of mine, but I was able to be part of that. That was like a really exciting thing, and being able to see the benefits of gathering people together with different skill sets and seeing how we collaborate and build something better for all of us was really a fun thing to do. That's probably the
Nice.
highlight thing people might maybe not know me from, but at least recognize in terms of industry.
Nice, nice. So somewhere along the way, you went from, slinging code and being awesome at it, every minute of the day, to being the leader of other programmers. Do you remember, how that transition happened?
A little bit. I think I've always so in high school I ended up doing a bunch of leadership organizations and camps and things like that. I think I've usually just put myself out there and naturally kind of stepped up. For example, when I went to Logos Bible Software and was working on their web team there, at one point they asked who wants to lead this effort, and it was like I think I'd been there for maybe a couple of weeks, and no one said anything. And I'm being the new guy, I was kind of hesitating, like, do I? I was trying to let other people jump ahead, and no one said something for like I don't know. Must have been at least 2 minutes. It felt like it was like 10.
Yeah.
And so it's like I'll do it. Like I felt like just being willing to step up and do it, knowing that I'm gonna end up being on the hook, but I'm not the one who has to do all the work.
Hmm.
And I felt good enough about being able to motivate my team and do some of the administrative tracking about what's going on and helping identify what different people could contribute and do, even within a couple weeks. That it, I guess, just some of the different things that I had done gave me that confidence to be able to try, and so I did. And that's kind of how I got started doing team leadership. There's definitely parts of that I'm good at, and parts that I'm not. I'm not a really great administrative type of person.
Hmm.
I think I am decently good at identifying what people are good at and can contribute or what they enjoy. I've learned through lots of mistakes as well in the last 10 or so years since starting to do team lead types of roles. But yeah, I think it was about that time. I was like maybe 3 years into doing professional development. Before
Hmm.
that, I'd been on, again, more like solo projects or smaller teams and things. So
Yeah.
it wasn't a whole lot of background to build off of.
Gotcha. There's some places where it might seem to a young programmer that, okay, I can be a programmer to a certain point, but then in order to progress, I have to become a manager, which means, you know, putting away my keyboard. and, and that thought, it's like, oh gosh, why would I want to do that? Coding is too much fun, which it is. So for someone who's kind of gone down that road and, past the 2 decade mark and whatnot, what would you say now that you wish somebody had said to you when you were, say, in your, first 5 years as a programmer?
Yeah, I wish someone would have told me that you don't necessarily have to choose. I feel like I've been fighting this battle to strike a balance between programming fairly routinely and leading teams and being a manager. I've managed to stave off becoming like a full-on engineering manager with no coding responsibilities
Hmm.
for at least 15 years. I like both things. I don't like having to pick one or the other. I like the people management aspects. Um, I really love coding. I don't like the idea of being like too far away from it. I do side projects just to learn new things all the time and different languages and different tools just to try to stay up to date on everything. Really, because it's a hobby. And so I
Hmm.
think even if I did become an engineering manager, it doesn't mean that I'd have to give up coding to some degree. And that's also given me some peace about this going forward. But yeah, the pressure. I felt like there was pressure early on that I need to pick a track early on, and so far I've never actually had to do that. So there's kind of a benefit, but also it almost felt scary because some of the people who were encouraging me that I need to pick that track early on were people who had been away from coding daily
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, and often gave me this sense that didn't really know what was going on in the industry anymore. They weren't as up to date on things. They were very hesitant to make changes or to lean into new tools or solutions or approaches that were showing really good promise, or that even if I did like a spike of something, they were like, "Well, that's not how we've been doing it. Let's not do that." And
Mm-hmm.
not to say that just because you're able to do a spike, you should definitely do that. It was just the like almost immediate reaction against any kind of consideration towards that. So, I mean, you asked, what would I say? I think it would be that you don't have to pick. There is still a way to balance the two things. You don't have to give it all up,
Mm-hmm.
and imagine that you're going to be some old crotchety used to be dev that's now only good at managing people. There is a way to kind of end up doing both, whether it's a lot of coding with a little people management, or a lot of people management with a little coding, again, kind of on the side or just for fun.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think because you and I kind of went through the dot com bust and the aftermath and whatnot,
Hmm.
similar time, and there's been a long run where there's just not enough fully qualified managers to manage the custom software groups. And so I
Yeah.
think by necessity, there's been other managers that have been pulled in that
Hmm.
probably don't have the right mix of competencies. But if you look at other industries, like would you would you want would you want the management chain of a finance company somebody that never did accounting, never was good at just basic accounting? Would you want somebody leading a law firm, somebody who never passed the bar and wasn't a lawyer, but yet we've had in client companies managers that maybe they did maybe some like IT stuff or some data center stuff, but they're over programmers, but
Right.
they haven't done programming. And so it, what's your thought on kind of that thinking?
I think it's similar to the idea that my family usually thinks that I can fix their printer. There's so many adjacent
Yes.
competencies in the quote unquote IT space that I think from a business owner or business management perspective, they're like, well, anybody who has any experience, it's all relevant experience and it all makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just not really true. Now that doesn't mean that they can't be good managers, but I definitely agree with your example of having like somebody who's never been a lawyer, never been an accountant, moving up into a higher level role that's overseeing all those different aspects. It's like, I suppose that there could be a successful person, but that's going to be a rare thing. And they're
Mm-hmm.
probably going to be the kind of person who really leans on their people to do the work and isn't trying to dictate. And I feel like that's usually the place where a lot of these things end up being problematic. As someone gets put in charge, they're either territorial or scared or prideful or something, and they're not willing or able to lean on their people and their skill sets. So I say that to say, it's possible that all those different managing scenarios you just gave are all possible and could end up being successful if the person coming in was really leaning on their people to do the work well and trusting them. And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's been a big part of the miss. And a lot of that really, I mean, even in small organizations that I've mostly worked at small organizations, politics becomes such a problem really quickly all over the place. And it takes a lot of effort to make sure that's not an issue. Um, and it seems like those roles end up getting into politics very, very quickly. And I think that ends up causing a lot of the strain and problems that people
Mm-hmm.
run into.
Yeah. Yeah.
So having somebody who has that experience as a developer or as a lawyer leading a legal team, or an accountant lead as a CFO, is almost required so that they know all the problems that their teams have faced in the past. And hopefully can lean on that memory to help protect and lead their organizations well, um, because they're probably not going to have a full capability to lean on their team to do the right thing all the time and trust them well.
Yeah. So when thinking about the individual developers on your team, what are some of the things that you're intentional about to make sure that they are fully empowered to do a really good job?
I think I've gotten better at this. I usually let them tell me how they feel about it. So I do one-on-ones with my team members, at least biweekly. And then I'll usually, if I'm wanting to push them into more of a leadership or kind of owning a space, I'll ask them first, like, what areas do you feel confident, like most confident in? Here's some things coming up. Is there anything in here that you feel ready to lead? And there's been a few occasions where I've needed to push people a little bit more
Hmm.
and give them a little bit more guidance. But I usually ask, and I favor really kind of handing it over and see where they are, rather than really try to give them a whole lot of assistance initially, like training wheels, and then add more as they need it. But on occasion, if somebody says they're really not confident about some aspect of either defining the requirements or managing who's working on what or whatnot, giving a little bit more support and meeting either maybe more daily, depending on what they feel comfortable with. Um, and then ultimately the goal is to kind of back off to where they own that whole thing, and that might take 2 or 3 different small projects or whatever, to where they feel confident leading another group of people and can really kind of step up into that team lead role.
Hmm.
I've seen people do that almost like immediately. We're like one project and they're like, "Oh, I get this," and they were kind of ready already because they're more people oriented. They're happy to work with other people, assign work to them, collaborate and lead. And I've worked with other people who really need a lot of work to figure out how to, like, not to come across too dictatorial or too rigid or even mean. I mean, a lot of these things are things that I've screwed up in the past as well. Uh, Getting, like, feeling the pressure or tension on a project that was time sensitive, and buckling under the pressure, and then like barking at my own teammates. So having gone through it myself, it makes it a lot easier to be sympathetic and empathetic towards my
Yeah.
newer
Yeah.
teammates, that trying to help them grow and deal with those same issues.
Sure.
So it ends up being funny because, like, a lot of it ends up being a lot of not quite counseling sessions among team members, but that can be part of the work.
Hmm. Okay.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So on the technical side and the engineering practices side, are there certain practices or tools or way that developers need to work that are non-negotiables for you? Like even young developers who maybe they don't have the perspective to tell you exactly what's going to make them successful. Have you accumulated, like, what's your short list of things? Okay, we're always going to do this, even if you don't want to. No, we're going to do it because you're going to be better off for it.
Yeah. There's a handful of things that. So first is always doing pull requests. So we've been using GitHub. I've been using GitHub, I think, at all the organizations I've been at for a very long time. But making sure that people are creating small commits, sending in pull requests, getting those reviewed by me or another team member before merging them in and pushing them up, keeping people's work in progress or work in process into like a very small, minimal number of things, in part to help focus everybody. Like, I don't want people, because I've done this myself as well, get too many things in flight and then you can't quite keep track of which one's which and things start getting messy. So really kind of, and this has been a hard thing because a lot of people want to keep moving and keep their velocity up, and reminding them that part of the project or part of their job is to actually get their thing all the way merged and then into the customer's hands.
Mm-hmm.
So if they have something that's been done but hasn't been approved, or it hasn't been merged in, or it hasn't been released, like, that's still their job to make sure that gets all the way. And if they need to follow different people, then that's part of the work. So the pull request process, getting things verified, making sure they're following through on the things that they're working on and keeping the current working set to a minimum, making sure that they're adding tests. It's crazy how often missing tests lead to, well, I guess it's not really that crazy. We know how missing tests lead to so many different bugs, because there's just even little conditional errors that you just need to flip the greater than to less than or whatever is such a common
Mm-hmm.
thing. And that may not be like full 100% test coverage, but at least something to verify, whether it's a UI test with like Storybook, or if it's a unit test for some piece of logic, some sort of verification that can be automated and checked to prevent regressions in the future. And a lot of that's really to help them think through the use case. I guess really a lot of that points back to just really understanding the problem. I want them to be able to retell to me what they're working on before they start, so they don't just go blindly trying to build something without really understanding what the problem is. The tests help with that. Usually notes or comments in their code that are visible in the pull request can help with that. I think that's kind of the main set for like a younger programmer that I would encourage them to do, and say like these all need to happen before we will accept what you're committing, and before we give you a whole lot more work, or even especially before I would try to push them into more of a leadership type of role, that they understand the benefits of all those things.
Okay. And I'd like to get your opinion on architecture or the modern technology that's come out, and especially in light of the discussion in our industry over the last 10 years between monolith and microservices, and of course, the stories on both ends. If each end is an extreme, have there been some architectural patterns that you just kind of use over and over and over because, hey, they just work in so many scenarios?
Yeah, I guess so. That's a really great question. I don't know that I have any like real rigid ones. I have really favored doing like JSON APIs for data. I've tried things like GraphQL, I've tried things like Protobuf. The RPC style tends to be very fragile and rigid, breaks easily. GraphQL, I have not had very good success with that, because it seems like a lot of people really kind of understand the RESTful patterns. And so they end up making GraphQL queries that are very rigid with handlers that are very rigid and can't really use those things very well. So I've usually leaned to that pattern. Other than that, I've varied across kind of monorepo to multiple repos for different services. A lot of it seems to really need to be fit to the team. So when I've seen the like multiple repos work well is when you have multiple teams responsible for each of those repositories. Then it makes sense for them to have their own little sandbox to play in that they control and manage and can customize to better suit what they're doing. Whereas when those things kind of collapse back into a larger team again at one point at a previous company, it became a real nightmare trying to manage multiple repositories with one team. So we ended up back to being a monorepo. Same thing with microservices. Microservices have been great in a lot of cases, with the ability to kind of really deploy different things at different rates at different times, rely on the fact that certain things didn't change as often, and make them be stable on a long-term basis. But then there have been cases where like that didn't make sense anymore. Either several services kind of collapsed back into one thing, but managed either by one team, or because the dependencies were identified that like actually needed multiple things to change altogether. And so it's been like it feels like a wave type of pattern where I've kind of gone to like splitting things up and bringing things back, but it's usually to sort of fit the team that's working on them, probably more than anything else. I guess that would be the pattern. Whatever tools or architectures you're using really need to fit the team and the solution that you're building. Building a big microservice architecture with multiple repos for a blog site would be a ridiculous thing, and I think we'd all recognize that. But a lot of times we're not really building things that are that complicated, but our repository or our architecture can be way more than what we need. So it's a good time at that point to just collapse things back down.
So just to repeat back, just make sure I understand your points, which are very, I think, very useful. You tend to design Git repository boundaries organizationally over technically.
Yes.
For organizational reasons rather than technical reasons. Okay, great.
Yep.
But then within one team, with the repository, it sounds like you have plenty of freedom to break things apart, have multiple things that deploy at different cadences, and the flexibility to change your mind and combine two things if it seems that those two things should be combined.
Yep.
Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm extrapolating now. If when you do split something to a separate Git repository and thereby a completely separate build process, deployment, testing environments, all
Mm-hmm.
that puts some more rework. If you do decide that you want to then combine two things, there's actually a lot more inertia there because you created a much stronger boundary to make that splitting decision reversible.
Right.
That's a good way to think about it, because so many
Yeah,
times,
I'm glad that you're rephrasing this because it's making it more clear for me too.
well, there's so many times where it's tempting to only think of the technical reasons why we might do something. And
Mm-hmm.
so and to assume that what we think today is what we're going to think in 4, 5, 6 months.
Yeah.
And that if we, and that reversibility is important. It's important to do things, but still preserve the opportunity to change our minds.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Glenn Block and I can't remember who the other co-authors were. They had a book called Evolvable Web APIs, and I feel like this is
Mm-hmm.
kind of an extrapolation of that concept of if you think about your system as like a long-lived thing, a long-lived organism, maybe it's going to change and evolve over time, and the more you can do to make sure it remains malleable without going overboard. Obviously, you could go crazy and make things like way too malleable ahead of time. But the more you can do to make sure you're not painting yourself into a corner that you can't get out of again, the better. And that's not to say that there's a perfect approach for doing so.
Mm-hmm.
If there is, I certainly haven't found it. But I think it's maybe more the willingness to adjust and try to keep things consistent across those repos if you can. Like you mentioned the build and CI and CD pipelines and things like that. If you can make sure you have a pretty consistent way of approaching that across your different repos,
Mm-hmm.
then it makes it a lot easier to kind of merge them back together if you want to. And when you split them, you have kind of pre-built pipelines that you can kind of lean to. So those
Yeah.
would probably be some good patterns to kind of try to define. But I haven't found anything that's like this is the absolute way to build a pipeline. It often seems like there's some minor changes or tweaks and things that are better for one type of project than another, and so a lot of this ends up being sort of fit the purpose. I've read a lot about game dev. I've never done any game dev, so for any game developers listening to this, please forgive any over generalities. But it seems like a lot of, and this may not be true anymore, since like game engines have become such a common thing, like with Unity and
Mm-hmm.
Unreal. But I know it
Yeah.
back in the day, it used to be common you'd build like a set of tooling for a game engine for a game or whatnot, and then you'd do it all again every time you built a new game. And I feel like to some degree that's sort of like what this might be a little bit. Maybe hopefully you reuse as much of you as you can, but otherwise just know that a lot of it's going to be temporary structures to support your current operations or your current development efforts and things. And it's okay if you throw it away and change it up or whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's close out with operations, or what they call it, life side operations, or
Hmm.
engineering support of the software running in production. Besides just the normal person of, okay, well, somebody needs to be designated as on call if something, serious happens. What are the things that you've learned to, always practically put in place so that the software is stable as it's running and just doesn't create this constant stream of work or maintenance for the engineering team to get distracted with just babysitting a software system in production?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple different things that I found have been helpful, especially for somebody who's going to be on call, or if you need to, maybe on like the small teams like I've been on, we haven't always had just anybody on call. It's just been kind of a shared thing. Whoever gets to it first gets it.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest thing has been having enough observability tooling and metrics to be able to create alerts that can send out notifications. Um, it's good to have a team schedule as to who's on call. A lot of the places I've been recently, that's not been as big of an issue because we're doing like B2B types of solutions where the normal working hours are generally in the US 8 to 5 hours. So like the worst case is it's like a couple hours earlier for East Coast time and a couple hours later for Pacific time. But um, having some sort of automation that can alert you to when things are going bad is almost critical. whether that shows up in Slack, if it hits your phone with a notification, something. We had some I won't say where, but I had an incident a long time ago where we didn't have that set up very well. And I think it was the end of the day on a Saturday. We had done a dumb thing and deployed on a Friday. So there'd be another one. Don't ever deploy on a Friday. We deployed on a Friday, what looked like a very innocuous minor update, and it ended up breaking an older version of the software's store page in the app. And so for about a whole day, and thankfully it wasn't like that version wasn't used by many people for the older versions, but we lost any attempts to purchase resources for that entire day. And so I ended up getting a call when somebody realized what was going on, because I think they just went and looked to see how many orders we had go through that one thing. And I didn't know anybody was even looking at it. I didn't even, for what it's worth, I didn't even know it existed. So it was part of the reason we missed this.
Yeah.
But there was no alerting. Somebody just happened to go look. They found out. So I got a call on a Saturday night, had to go up to the office and start working on it. And I was the only one they could reach, which is why I got to be me. It didn't take long to fix it. We got it rolled out like within an hour, but it's like, man, I really wish we had some way of pinging these things. So having like a health check that all the different APIs and resources, knowing really what all your dependencies are, which is just documentation. So many people fail at that. I'm still bad about that. It's easy to just forget the different dependencies, especially if you're doing, and we just mentioned evolvability. So as your application or software is evolving over time, those dependencies change. Knowing what versions are still active and supported, knowing what their dependencies are, having observability and metrics and things hooked up that can then send out alerts and notifications. I think the more automation you can do around that, the better. And then having the call rotation and things becomes more of a assigning ownership over who has what at what time, more so than it is like a real, here's like a massive checklist of things to go through, which is often what I've ended up having to create in the past when we didn't have the observability and automation that we really needed. So that's almost been more of a, I want to cover myself and make sure that I'm successfully maintaining the app well, adding all those different layers in, which usually feels like an afterthought. It's so much better to think about that up front. Make sure you're documenting and logging all that stuff as you go, not as an afterthought, not after you've put all your PRs in, released to production as now I'm going to go do those things, because it's so easy to forget, because now the next feature is ready to roll out, or now the next bug has come up and you need to jump on that. Make sure that's part of the process, and maybe even like a lead to the rest of everything else you're doing, that you're tying all those things in and making sure you're hooking up all your observability and metrics as early as possible.
Yeah. Other parts of the business tend to have processes for, if this were to happen, this is what we do. And when they have something that happens that they don't have a process for, predictable chaos, because then it's trying to figure out on the fly. Well, the same thing in software. If a particular component or dependency is offline, throwing errors, not doing what it's supposed to, we need to decide, hey, what should we do? Is it okay that it just doesn't work and we can't sell certain types of things? Is that okay? Or all the way down the spectrum to everybody, including, top executives of the company, get notified immediately and start doing, press coverage and crisis communication, in every form in between. And just talking about those things, it's not hard to decide, hey, is this like, if a backup logging provider to a text file, stops working, should we shut down the whole system? Or no, let's just fix it, but keep everything going.
Yeah.
Versus, if I can't talk to my main database, it's like, whoa, okay, we need to stop and fix it now. I love the health check APIs that Microsoft has finally kind of blessed and had as a first class citizen in the libraries, because it's not new. I mean, it's a old pattern, but when every team is left to remember, okay, we need this pattern and this pattern and this pattern and this pattern, just having that tiny library, again, it's not complicated code, but just it's like it gives you a C# interface. It names it, and now everyone's like, oh, okay, I just need one of these for every dependency. And the few lines of code is going to be a little bit different for each one, but remember to put it there.
Yeah. And the builder pattern, I mean, I know this has been becoming much more popular for a lot of different frameworks and tools. But the builder pattern that C# adopted with the ASP.NET Core stuff and ASP.NET 5 was
Mm-hmm.
super helpful because now you knew exactly where to put it. I mean, I guess you always had like global ASACs back in the day where all your kind of wiring up stuff went. But
But it got massive
I
and
don't know if
disorganized, and well, I
yeah,
guess it
it's like
still does
it
somewhat.
feels
But
so much more nicer now the way that ASP.NET has built some of that stuff out, and even
yeah.
like other like console apps and things. Like I built almost every. I mean, I'm not doing .NET professionally now, but when I was a few years ago, it was like everything I built ended up having like I'm gonna use the builder pattern. Even if I could build a console app without it, I'm still
Mm-hmm.
gonna put it in here
Yeah.
because now I have a very easy way to go to. I guess there's another pattern you asked about earlier. Could probably be something I would recommend and reuse everywhere. Making sure you have a single place where you can wire up all the core configuration or functionality or pieces like this, like with health checks and things. Um,
Yeah.
One of the thing I didn't touch on, but I think is important because you mentioned being able to make decisions easily.
Mm-hmm.
Like two things that are really often forgotten and are really really important and really do help make the decisions easier is performance implications. Like we had health checks, but you're now like spiking your database because you're like hitting it too hard or you're trying to do like a full
Yeah.
count or a really complex like clearly that's not a good thing and need to be careful about that. But it could also indicate that like, oh, every once in a while we have some database problems. Maybe your database just needs more resources or it needs
Mm-hmm.
more connect. Like something could be going on. So it could be that adding those health checks gives you some performance things. Like we just recently added an automated series of checks to like hit certain pages of our apps for some different customers because we started noticing at various times like there were some data issues. So we're still collecting the data on that. But that leads to another thing. We started that as with 10-minute intervals. Well, the cost on GitHub Actions went way up real fast. We're like, oh,
Mm.
there's a cost aspect to this too, and that's
Yeah.
another thing that I think, especially as developers, we're not usually thinking about the costs of things. But a lot of us are building things and running them in the cloud. The cloud prices are going up. Like, it's really important. It may not be the most critical thing, but it is worthwhile to think about how much am I spending? Are there more cost-effective solutions? Yeah, you could probably solve any problem, but maybe there's a cost benefit threshold that you need to consider as you're going through this. And I think that gets into some of this engineering leadership stuff that we are talking about earlier as well, is being aware of that. That may be one of the areas that best differentiates sort of an engineering leader from just a developer or a development team lead. Somebody who's thinking about the cost implications, either for your own company, your own business,
Mm-hmm.
for your customer's business, all those different things, and figure out how to make the best trade-offs to solve the problem you've been given, while not, you know, throwing money away or even causing something to be no longer profitable because you've picked either the wrong technology, you've picked the wrong deployment model, you're just wasting resources. There's so many different ways you can throw money away. And it's becoming a lot easier to do so. So many different tools and techniques, and I mean, we just added a whole bunch of
Mm-hmm.
things to a solution that people might not think about. All of that costs money.
Yeah.
All of that has potential performance impacts. So all things to be wrestling with, which I guess makes the calculation a little more complex. But once you have all that data, usually, as you said, like the decision becomes very clear and very easy to make. Now you know which way you should go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Awesome. Well, Ryan, I appreciate you coming on and sharing, your perspective running a software development group. It's been really valuable. I know that there's a lot of listeners out there who are looking forward in their career and kind of trying to figure out where to point themselves, and I know that they appreciate the perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you for rephrasing several of the things that I said to bring better clarity to it, because I think I actually learned several things in this conversation. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.